Welcome to Delivering Miracles, a podcast to teach women like you tips and strategies on how you can have a safer pregnancy so you can bring home a healthy baby. I'm your host and your high-risk pregnancy expert, Parijat. I can't wait to chat with you. When you think of gestational diabetes, what do you think of? I think of this horrible, disgusting, torturous, orange, syrupy drink that kind of reminds me of, do you remember Triaminic when we were younger? It was like this medicine that we used to take when we'd get sick. I can't remember for what, if it was for cold or fever or something, but it was so disgusting. It was so gross. And now this drink they force pregnant women to drink to test for gestational diabetes is like insane, because not only are you not allowed to eat breakfast or eat anything before you drink it, then you have to drink this like completely horrid drink on top of it, and then try not to throw up, and then find out if you have gestational diabetes. It's so bad. I was on hospital bed rest when I was tested for gestational diabetes. And I remember fighting with my nurses and my MFM at that point. Like, do you really want to test me for one more thing? Like, really, can we just pretend I don't have it? Because I probably don't. But they're like, no, you're about the right gestational age. We want to check and make sure. And at this time, right, it was around 24 weeks. I was like, even if I had gestational diabetes, isn't that a good thing? Because the baby's going to get bigger, and that's what we're trying to hope for, because we don't want him to come so soon. But they didn't listen, and, I drank this stupid drink and almost threw up because it was so disgusting. And the combination of not having moved at all for the last 10 days, so I'd been bedridden for 10 days, plus having been given the betamethasone shots, which are the steroid injections that you get if you're at risk of preterm delivery. They're meant to speed up your baby's lung development, so kind of giving them an extra boost in case baby does come early. So between those two things of not moving and having had that shot, guess what I had? I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes. It was no surprise because I had all these risk factors going against me. But at that point, that had become my 7th complication in my pregnancy. And I was so annoyed. Like, really, one more thing. Really, this is how this is playing out. But here's the thing. It wasn't the diagnosis that bothered me. It was how they treated me and my diagnosis since then. It was, so I'd been in the hospital for 10 days, 7th complication. This was like 17 marathons, one right after the other. I was exhausted. I was burned out. I was overwhelmed by everything that was going on. I was trying to stay pregnant as long as I possibly could. And I didn't do a great job of advocating for myself. I'll be really honest with you about that. And so it fell on my husband and my friend and my parents to speak up for me, especially around gestational diabetes, because I couldn't deal with one more thing. And so I remember, for example, my husband was always having to kick the nutritionist out of the room because she kept bringing in peanuts for me to eat, and I'm deathly allergic to peanuts. And so it was little things like that where we had to monitor everything, but we didn't know enough about it. We didn't have time to learn about it. And we didn't really know how to get the care that I needed. And so one day I was on this super strict diet in the hospital, and literally my readings were like 2 or 3 points above normal. So it wasn't even like I had a really bad test result, but they were treating me extremely seriously. And one day I ended up having a slightly high reading when they were checking my blood glucose levels. And the hospital staff rushed in and gave me insulin, which is probably the only time in my pregnancy that I still regret I did not say anything. Most of the time, I think I did a really good job of getting the care that I needed and walking away when I didn't need it or didn't want it. This one, I was just so overwhelmed, and I was so dizzy that I was just not feeling great because I was lying upside down in Trendelenburg. I just wasn't thinking straight. They gave me the insulin, And what did that do but tank my blood sugar and made me so lightheaded that I almost passed out. So then I was asked to drink juice and eat fruit to bring it back up, which made no sense to me. Oh my God, I'm still just like so frustrated about that. And it made me so angry that this complication that happens to so many women is so poorly managed. Because so many women are so poorly educated, and it's not their fault. It's not your fault if you don't know a lot about it. It's doctors don't know a lot about it either. And so it kind of becomes this label of, here, you got gestational diabetes. Here's a pamphlet. Go follow along and let's hope everything works out. And it really bugs me. I mean, in my case, gestational diabetes was the least of my problems. And likely it was because of these external factors anyway. But I don't like the fact that it was one more thing I didn't know how to deal with. I knew how to deal with most everything else that was happening. I didn't know how to deal with this one, which is why I am so thrilled to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Lily Nichols, who is the expert of experts on gestational diabetes. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian nutritionist, a certified diabetes educator, researcher, speaker, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition and exercise. Her book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and the online course of the same name presents a revolutionary nutrient-dense, lower-carb diet for gestational diabetes. Her unique approach has helped hundreds of women manage their gestational diabetes naturally and is currently being used in several research studies. Lily is also the creator of the popular blog PilatesNutritionist.com, which explores a variety of topics related to real food nutrition, digestive health, and pregnancy. Welcome, Lily. I'm so glad that you're here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm super excited. I mean, I am like so passionate about this just because I'm so furious with the way that my situation was handled. And I hear it from so many women about how their situation is just, they feel helpless. They feel misguided. And I'm just so glad that we're talking about this because I think this is a conversation so many women need to hear.
Yes. Actually, hearing your story, I was like cringing.
Right?
Listening to all the details. Oh my gosh, there are so many things I would have done differently. But again,
yes.
Yeah, sometimes the hospital management of gestational diabetes is the worst of the worst from what I've observed. So
yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's so important. We need to empower women because I wish that I had known more so that at least even if I couldn't speak up for myself because I was on magnesium, I was hallucinating, at least I could have told someone else.
Yes.
Like, hey, this is what to do.
Yes.
So, I mean, I've got 10 million questions for you, but I'd love to know first, how did you get into this work to help women with gestational diabetes?
You know, it's actually super random. I wish I had some like amazing story, but I came into the gestational diabetes world a little bit by accident. I was at the time looking for a part-time job. I was like part-time teaching Pilates. I was already a dietitian. I was switching gears in my dietitian part of my career. And I saw a job opening for an organization called the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, Sweet Success. And I applied and got the job. And here I was working on public policy for gestational diabetes, which is something that I knew a little bit about. I had seen it in my internship when I was in LA at County USC Medical Center. But it wasn't something that I knew a ton about. So it was actually when I started working in that organization, when I was coming up to speed on everything that I needed to know and be able to teach and relay to other professionals, just how crazy this diagnosis is and how a mom's blood sugar during pregnancy could have long-lasting impacts on her baby. I just was not really fully aware of how important this diagnosis is.
Totally.
But essentially, you know, a mom who has uncontrolled blood sugar during pregnancy, her child can face up to a 6-fold higher risk of obesity or type 2 diabetes by the time they turn 13.
Wow.
There are your baby's like development, how their DNA is transcribed, how their pancreas is being formed and their insulin secretion is being set up for the rest of their life. That's impacted by a mom's blood sugar levels. So if we can, diagnose women, catch it early, get it well managed, we can drastically lower the rates of type 2 diabetes, especially childhood type 2 diabetes, obesity, and all these other complications. Plus, mothers who have gestational diabetes can face a higher risk for type 2 diabetes later in life. So if we get it well managed, get them all the, necessary, proper nutrition education, which we'll talk about a little bit later, so they know how to manage their blood sugar, they can actually carry that information with them the rest of their lives and also lower their chances of having to deal with diabetes. So it's kind of like the warning lights come on in the car when you're pregnant. I think in your circumstances, yours was a little different, and that it was probably more due to bed rest and being on steroids for sure. However, for a lot of women, it is like a sign that there's some pre-diabetic or diabetic tendencies, and you can actually turn that, turn your future chances of that disease risk like completely 180 with lifestyle interventions. So I saw it as like a really awesome place for me to make a difference. So I worked there for a bit, and then I also worked clinically with women with gestational diabetes. And what was interesting about working clinically is I was able to put the guidelines that I'd been working on in my previous position into practice and see how they worked. And I was actually pretty taken aback to see that oftentimes the conventional nutrition guidelines for gestational diabetes didn't work that well. And a lot of my clients' blood sugar actually got worse. And a lot of them, like approximately 50% or so, required insulin or medication to manage their blood sugar. And
that's a really high percentage.
Yeah, a lot of the research is around 40% will end up needing blood sugar medication.
I mean, that's not okay with me. Like, how is that okay? If you see a number that high, like that's got to be an indication clearly what we're recommending is not working.
Right. So that got me on a bit of a research junkie binge fest for a while to figure out like what we could do better. And I mean, the obvious place for me to go was that, we should change up the nutrition guidelines so it's not so many carbohydrates, because when you look at which nutrients impact blood sugar, carbohydrates impact them the most. Fat and protein don't tend to cause blood sugar to go up much.
Right.
So why can't we go lower carb? And, at the time I was already eating fairly low carb. So when I'd give this gestational diabetes diet, which was higher in carbs than even I was eating, it was kind of like, this is weird. I mean, it's lower than the conventional standard of, 250 plus grams of carbs a day, but still they recommend a minimum of 175 grams of carbohydrates per day. And in my research, I found that there's no evidence to back up that minimum amount of carbs. Everyone warns women that if you go lower than that amount of carbs, your baby's not going to grow well. The placenta needs carbs. You're going to go into a state called ketosis where you're burning fat for fuel, and you have ketones, which are toxic, and they're going to harm your baby's development. And so I really went heavy into the research to see what I could find. And I found out that outside of diabetic ketoacidosis, going low carb, is safe. Having low levels of ketones, spilling in your urine is normal, does not reflect blood ketone levels. Like there's just so many things that I uncovered. And so I started recommending lower carb, and lo and behold, our rates of needing insulin and medication were slashed in half.
Wow.
And we have great outcomes. So
yes,
it took me a while to, get the confidence to publish what I had found, because it was such a big no-no in the dietetics field, and still is, to recommend lower carb. There's just still so much misinformation on it. So I wrote my book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I cited the crap out of it, especially the chapter that talks all about how the carbohydrate recommendations aren't based on solid science, and what we need to know about all the different forms of ketosis and which ones are harmful and which ones aren't. I just had to just had to cite it like crazy and back everything up
Yes.
with science. So it's not like me just making this stuff up, you know. But yeah, we had great outcomes, and the studies generally show like lower glycemic index diets, lower carbohydrate diets have better outcomes for pregnant women. And you know, I ate low carb, pretty low carb during my pregnancy, had great outcomes as well. So I don't know, but a lot of the women who read my book, they've just been, you know, struggling to figure out what this gestational diabetes thing is. They've been eating, you know, 45 grams to 60 grams of carbohydrates per meal as they've been instructed, and their blood sugar is not good.
Yeah.
And it's either like, you know, continue eating that way and go on insulin or medication,
Which a lot of women
or
don't want to do.
which they don't want to do.
Yeah.
And for me, you know, gestational diabetes, one of the ways you can define it is carbohydrate intolerance of pregnancy, meaning your
Yeah.
body does not tolerate large amounts of carbohydrates. So why would we push more carbohydrates in a meal than even they may have had at a glucose tolerance test? You know, the first,
Totally.
it depends on how it's screened. We can talk about all the screening methods, but a lot of women go through what's called a two-step screening method where you get a 50-gram test, and then if you fail that, you get a 100-gram test.
That's
So
right.
if you fail a 50-gram test with high blood sugar, why would we expect you to have normal blood sugar eating 60 grams of carbohydrates? It just doesn't make sense. It's
It
just
doesn't.
not logical. So
I mean, it sounds like your approach to all of this is just so much more intuitive. Like, let's actually listen to the body
yes.
and see what it's telling us, which is
Yes.
exactly what is totally in line with the way that I help my clients too. It's just
Yes.
let's listen to what your body is telling us and
Yes.
go from there.
Exactly.
So-
and then, yeah, you just eat to what your if your blood sugar is high from what you're eating, then make an adjustment. Don't keep doing what you're doing and feel like you're stuck. You know,
Yeah.
some people will need insulin. That is true, and that's
Sure.
not a bad thing. But I find that for a lot of these more mild cases of gestational diabetes, it's not needed. Or in the women who do need insulin, a lot of times they don't need as high of a dose if we're not stoking the fire with more and more carbohydrates, driving the blood sugar up and up and up. So
Right. And I love the approach that you're suggesting and that you practice. I love that at the heart of it, what it does is it makes women feel less helpless about this. Because I think a lot of women who get the diagnosis, they go, oh crap. Now I can't eat anything, and now I don't know what to do, and my baby's going to be humongous, and I'm going to be on insulin, and I don't want any of that to be real. And what you're doing is you're empowering women to say, okay, let's pay attention to what really matters, and let's get your control back in this, because you have control still.
right.
When you are working with women, what would you say are the top three most common misconceptions about gestational diabetes that they have?
Oh gosh, this is going to be so hard to pick the top three. One is that they did something to cause this. There are a lot of different risk factors for gestational diabetes, but a lot of these things are outside of your control, meaning your, you know, family history of diabetes, where your parents are from. So if you're essentially any ethnicity other than white, if there's a higher chance of type 2 diabetes in your culture, there's a higher chance of gestational diabetes as well. It's just a fact of life, and it's genetic, and that we can't control. Your age, as you get older, your body tends to get more insulin resistant, which generally means your body does not do as good of a job of lowering your blood sugar with the insulin that's naturally in your body. So that, again, you can't exactly control. And then finally, I would say your weight at conception, which I guess in some ways is in your control, but if you're at, you know, all the way halfway through your pregnancy, not really. You can't like rewind the clock and like lose weight 6 months ago or anything. So that also can change the risk for gestational diabetes. A history of PCOS. Again, some of these things may have been somewhat modifiable in the past, but not always. And then there's the simple fact that about 50% of women who get diagnosed don't have any of the traditional risk factors. And it's just this random occurrence. It's just, it is what it is. Naturally, our bodies become a little more insulin resistant during pregnancy. And if your pancreas isn't able to adapt and pump out more insulin, or if there's anything that's affecting your level of insulin resistance, which, like I said, could be, something that is not in your control whatsoever, you may end up with gestational diabetes. So I think a big thing is for women to stop beating themselves up so much, because I think there's so many questions on why me, why is this happening? And that just makes it just leads you to not a good mental place, because it doesn't really matter why or what. It's just, what are you going to do about it now? Like, how can you move forward today? How is this going to impact your pregnancy now? What can you eat today? How can you manage your stress today? And I feel like after a week or two with the diagnosis, like, some of these why me questions tend to settle down a little more.
Yeah.
But it is really overwhelming when you're initially diagnosed.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that overwhelm, I think, as we talked about earlier, comes from the fact that doctors, and you're saying also a lot of dietitians, are misinformed about what gestational diabetes is. So I'm curious what you find are the common misconceptions that OBs have, and maybe even other dietitians have, about gestational diabetes that are perpetuating that sense of overwhelm in patients.
Oh gosh. I think one of the big things is the whole big babies thing. Well, twofold. I think I'll say insulin. They assume that insulin is almost always required. Like, you'll need insulin no matter what. It's just a matter of time. That is simply not true, because the first step to managing gestational diabetes is food and lifestyle tweaks, not insulin. But
Right.
if your healthcare provider is, and that's not just, me saying that, this is like very well accepted across all domains, but doesn't always get translated in the research. But if providers, if their only experience is with a conventional high carbohydrate diet therapy, they do probably end up prescribing insulin or blood sugar lowering medication a lot.
A lot,
So
yeah.
that's what they know. That's what they're used to. They're used to giving insulin or metformin or glyburide, like, writing scripts for that all day long. So, like I said before, insulin and blood sugar lowering medication are amazing tools, and we need to have these tools in our toolbox for gestational diabetes. There will always be some women who will need it. It doesn't mean they have failed or done anything wrong. It's sometimes a physiological thing that you can't control. Like,
Right.
you
Totally.
need the help, and it's better to be on medication and have normal blood sugar than to not be on medication, be trying to, control every little bit of food that you're eating and still have high blood sugar and be stressing about that, and have your baby be, being exposed to that at the same time. So it is needed, but it's not needed in all cases, and it's not needed in nearly as many cases if we give better nutrition advice. And
Right.
then,
So if we can avoid it, then great. If you can do
right,
everything to manage your lifestyle, to manage your diet better,
right,
and then you can avoid taking it, then awesome.
yes,
But if you are doing all of that and you're still needing the medication, that's perfectly okay too, because what's
right,
most important is the health of your health and the health of your baby.
right. And so a lot of it is just allowing, a week, 2 weeks, it depends on the provider you're with. But when I worked clinically and I was working with a gestational diabetes perinatologist who had been doing this work for like 30 years. So as long as blood sugar numbers weren't ridiculously high, I mean, because there are cases where you do need to intervene with medication like off the bat. You see the blood sugar readings and you're like, whoa, okay, this is not healthy. But a lot of times we would give a week or 2 weeks of working on nutrition and lifestyle tweaks and see how much progress we could make. And sometimes it was shocking. Sometimes we'd see
Absolutely.
30-point drops or more in blood sugar readings and have them come all the way down to normal levels. And here, when I first looked at the numbers, I'd be like, oh man, this person might need medication soon. But we'd give a little bit of grace, give a little bit of time and see what happens. And then it's empowering, like you said, to the woman too, to know that she's tried everything she can too. So I think that's something that providers need to kind come more on board with. And, that's one of the reasons that some practitioners who have seen good results with my real food approach, they actually will just give out a copy of my book to their clients and be like, do this and let's see we'll see you at your next visit and we'll see where we go from here. And that's really cool to have that available to people. I'd say the second thing, I could just go on and on, but another thing that's big with providers is they assume that all women with gestational diabetes will have big babies. And
that's a really common thought, I think, even amongst moms. Like that, I thought that too, that, oh, okay, well, he's going to be a little bit bigger, which he wasn't. But
right.
Just moms, I think, in general also think that way too.
Right. And statistically, it holds up, okay? Because statistically, if your blood sugar tends to be on the higher end, baby has a more higher supply of fuel, so to speak, and the baby's pancreas at a certain stage in pregnancy starts making insulin, which tells it to store more of that extra energy as fat. So generally, as blood sugar is higher, babies will grow bigger. I mean, yeah, it's a known risk for gestational diabetes. It's more so a problem with uncontrolled gestational diabetes. And that's where you can have, 12, 13 plus pound babies. But to assume that all women have this, or to assume that women who have great blood sugar control will still have a big baby is not evidence-based. The chances of having a large baby, like I said, correlates very strongly to blood sugar control during pregnancy. And it also, some studies have actually shown weight gain during pregnancy or pre-pregnancy body weight are actually more associated with big babies than even having the label, so to speak, of gestational diabetes.
I have heard that too, that your weight before pregnancy is pretty highly correlated with the size of your baby.
Yes. However, I will say that I've had clients who have a pretty high BMI. So the BMI is like your body mass index, right? So your ratio of height to weight, and over 30 is considered in the obese category. I've had women who are have a BMI of 45, so pretty heavy, and they have had normal weight babies because their blood sugar has been really well controlled. So again, it's not like none of these things are guarantees. There's always exceptions to the rule, but doctors assume the worst of the worst, and they associate gestational diabetes with big babies because what they've heard about, and as doctors, they always have to be looking to worst case scenario. They're thinking this baby's going to be big. Oh my gosh, we're going to need a C-section. Oh, like all these things. And they're not thinking about, well, what happens when you've, diagnosed gestational diabetes and gotten it well managed, and the woman has gained the appropriate amount of weight and her nutrition is really good and blah, blah, blah. You probably won't have a big baby. And in practice, the rates of big babies have been actually pretty small in my experience. And I run an online course for women with gestational diabetes, and we have yet to have a woman who's had a large baby. I don't think we've had a woman yet have a baby over 9 pounds. I mean, which isn't even that big anyways. Like that, there's definitely healthy 9-pound babies out there. My mom didn't have gestational diabetes, and I was 9 pounds. So who knows? But
what I keep
guaranteed.
Coming back to though, that as you say that is the patient's experience of it, right? Because now, she hears she has gestational diabetes. That's scary. Like, oh gosh, there's something wrong with my pregnancy. And then she starts thinking about, oh my gosh, all these limitations that I'm going to have, and what do I do, and how do I do this, and this sounds really overwhelming. And then to be told you're likely going to have a huge baby and maybe likely a C-section, that's just scary.
Yeah.
That's really scary as a patient to hear all these things. It's like a cascade of things falling down, and it's terrifying, and it's really overwhelming. And what I hear you saying is, hey, let's bust these myths so that there's less to be afraid of here, and there's so much more to feel empowered about, because this does not have to be the way this goes down for you.
Yes.
That's awesome. Yes. That's what we need more. That message is what we need so much more for pregnant women, because there's so many scary messages everywhere. And to know that, hey, actually, we can handle this. and you can do this and it'll be okay as long as we keep the ultimate goal in mind, which is keeping your blood sugars in a normal level and keeping your health and baby's health in the forefront. There's a lot we can still do, and this is not an end all be all just because you're diagnosed with this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Give them back some sense of control, or at least know what you can control and what you can't control. And yeah, I always point women in the direction of evidence-based birth. You're probably familiar with that blog. I actually worked with Rebecca on a research study about a year or two ago. But anyways, she has some good articles on big babies. She has one, does gestational diabetes always mean big baby and induction? She has some great articles on that where she goes through all the evidence on that. And it's great. It's very empowering. But I do find it frustrating that kind of where we're at with gestational diabetes is women are expecting worst of the worst, providers are expecting worst of the worst, and then it seems like the diagnosis starts to take away your control of your pregnancy and your rights to the way you want to birth. And that actually really, really bothers me. I really want to...
Me too.
It's so hard because you always want to like... I feel like in pregnancy, especially, a lot of the emphasis is like your control, like your sovereignty as a human being is somehow taken away because everything suddenly is about the baby. But all of the decisions about the baby are also about you too. And you don't want to make any decision that's going to put your baby at risk, of course. But what if what you're being recommended isn't actually evidence-based? You know, it takes 15 plus years for research to get into practice and for providers to sort of change their way of doing things. So I think there's, you know, gestational diabetes is most definitely on a spectrum. There are some women who have very mild insulin resistance or blood sugar issues that's easily managed with lifestyle. And then there are women who have, you know, probably actually had pre-existing prediabetes or type 2 diabetes that wasn't caught until pregnancy, and their blood sugar levels are quite high and most definitely benefit from medication and insulin. And then within that category, there may be some who don't have the best control. And so you have this big spectrum. You have some women where it's like a non-issue, and you have some women where it's a very serious issue. And so the risks to mom and baby are on this, again, a huge spectrum. But because they still fall under this same umbrella of gestational diabetes, this same fear tactics and you know, cascade of interventions are placed upon them. It's just like,
and they're treated the same, and the expectations are the same, and that's not at all how it plays out in real life.
Exactly. So that's really what irks me, and that's not something that I believe I'll be able to change. But the more women that I can give better advice so they can better manage their blood sugar numbers. So when they go into their doctors and they're like, wow, you have like non-diabetic blood sugar. I don't know what's going on here. Well, everything's good. Oh, hey, your baby's measuring in like the 45th percentile still. Oh, you're really not showing any signs of gestational diabetes. Like, that's what I like to hear. I like to hear more women able to stay with the provider of their choice, have the birthing options of their choice, and again, feel more empowered by this diagnosis, not like beat down by it.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are diagnosed right now with gestational diabetes and are likely feeling that overwhelm and just confusion about what to do, what do you think are the first like 2 or 3 things that they have to do right now because they are diagnosed?
Well, number one, if they are not already, would be to watch your blood sugar numbers at home. Check your blood sugar numbers, check them religiously first thing in the morning and then after each meal. And depending on your doctor, they may have different, you know, goal blood sugar numbers for you, or goal times for you to test your blood sugar, whether it's 1 hour or 2 hour after meals. But just track those numbers and see what's happening. This is like your window into your body. So you can get an idea of, is the food that you're eating working for you? Are your blood sugar numbers like above or within the goal range? That's the only way that your doctor determines if you need medication or not, is your blood sugar numbers. That's the only way that you know. if what you're eating is working for your body or not working for your body. You just have to keep coming back to the numbers. And it is super annoying to poke yourself 4 times a day. It is.
I do remember that.
Yes. And I monitored my blood sugar for a portion of my pregnancy, and it was like, oh man, I can see why like all my clients over these years hated this so much, because you're like you have to sort of like pause and like before you like do the little prick, and then you're kind of you're like waiting for the results to come in. You're like, oh my god, it's going to be high and low, and you start getting palpitations and like, oh my god. Yeah. There's you just have to get used to it. And I'd say after like a couple days of it, I was finally like, okay, it is what it is. This is how it's going to go. Yeah. And it shouldn't hurt, by the way. You should be, you'll feel a little prick, but if you
like
test on like,
by a or something, like, it's not that bad.
Test on the side of your finger, not like right at the center on the tip where all the nerve endings are. And that usually helps. And switch up the fingers that you're checking on, so you're not constantly getting your index finger and have a bunch of like scabby, bruised marks.
Yes.
So yeah, check your blood sugar. I would definitely say if the information you've been given on food is not helping your blood sugar, then start to do a little more reading on carbohydrate needs and pregnancy, because you don't have to eat 45 to 65 grams of carbohydrates per meal or more, however much they've told you. Sometimes it's really crazy. You don't need to eat a ton of carbs. And in fact, we know that pregnancy prenatal diets tend to be more nutrient dense, meaning have more of the vitamins and minerals that your baby needs to grow when carbohydrate levels are slightly lower. So you don't need to fill up on a minimum amount of rice or bread or potatoes or pasta or whatever, fruit at meals. You need to eat enough fat and protein, and then have, you know, if you can fit in and get away with having some more carb rich stuff, great. And if not, if your blood sugar doesn't respond well to that, you don't have to do it. So, and if you're really afraid about going lower carb because you've been told you need a minimum amount of carbohydrates, I do highly recommend checking out my book. The last chapter goes through all the research on it. So if you've been warned about ketones and all sorts of nonsense, then read that chapter and then make a choice if you want to keep doing what you're doing or you want to change it up. And then lastly, I guess I would just say, you know, it's so hard, but choose a provider who's really open to an open, honest conversation with you and isn't just fear-mongering or shaming you during your visits, because I hear about this a lot. And if you're with a provider that's, you know, constantly talking about weight or your blood sugar is too high and you know, this is your fault, or your baby's giant even though they have no evidence to show that that's actually the case, or you need to schedule an induction for 39 weeks, or you're going to have a C-section automatically. All women with gestational diabetes do. You're not actually getting an accurate message from them.
Yes.
And when you're being shamed during visits, it's a pretty good indication that you're not going to be treated with respect and your choices are not going to be honored during your birth. So we know there's always circumstances around birth that are not within our full control. That's just the fact of life with birth. However, some of these signs are, you can take some of these warning signs early on and find a provider who's more supportive. And oftentimes, if and when your blood sugar gets better managed, sometimes you'll actually be able to, you know, not have to see necessarily like a high risk provider if your blood sugar is well controlled. So sometimes, because if you're with a lower risk provider, they tend to see less interventionist births. Sometimes they're more supportive of, you know, letting you make some choices. So
absolutely.
Just find someone who's supportive of you and at least treats you with respect when they're talking about whatever is going on.
Which should be the norm anyway.
I know.
Right? Like, it's ridiculous that we have to even say that specifically, but here we are. We have to say it. So if you are in a situation where you're doubting whether this is the doctor you need to be with, please take this as a sign that you have every right to question it and to move to somebody else, because you deserve that respect and support through pregnancy all the way through your delivery experience.
Yes. And it's so hard when you're in their shoe, in that place.
Yeah, it's hard.
You know, it's really hard to advocate for yourself. Like, I remember when I was pregnant, even some of the simplest thing, like, no, I don't want to do that test, or I don't know, whatever the whatever the conversation of the visit was. I think I had a pretty non-complicated pregnancy, but there was a week where my fundal height was low, and was like the same as the week before or something. So it was lower than they expected. So like, oh my gosh, your baby might be small. And they even said, like, well, what if your baby is small? And I was like, well, honestly, there's nothing more that I can do right now than to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm not going hungry. I gained like 3 pounds last week. So either the measurement's off or the baby dropped, but worrying about this isn't gonna help it.
It's not gonna help anybody.
I guess we can just watch it at my next visit and see what happens, you know? But it was like this immediate jump to, oh my God, something's wrong. And it was like, no, just let's be calm about this, you know?
Exactly.
But, so again,
and when you're able to tap into your body and really listen to it and really trust your body, understand what's happening in your body, you can have the confidence to push back. I see this with my clients all the time too, is nurses freak out. They're going, oh my God, you're going to deliver really early. And I literally have clients going, no, this is not preterm labor. I know it now. I'm confident in it. Yeah. And that's what you deserve to be able to do and be able to have. And you need to be supported by a team that will encourage that from you. And if you don't, you have every right to leave and find somebody else who will do that for you, because you deserve it.
Yeah. And you always have a right to take a breather.
Exactly.
10 minutes, ask them to leave the room to think about it, or come back to it at another visit to make any sort of decisions if you're feeling pressured into anything or not feeling respected during the visit, or whatever it is you always have the right to think about things. Nothing is, that's part of informed consent. Is you're given all the information and you make a choice. So I just
we could talk about this for years. I mean, this exact thing. I completely agree with you. Absolutely. Yes. So, Lily, for our listeners who have gestational diabetes or are worried about developing gestational diabetes, what are your final words of hope for them?
Well, understand, I think, as I've alluded to, that you don't have to be a statistic. And in fact, a lot of the associated risks of gestational diabetes are based on statistics. So statistically, among a large group of women, many of whom may not have the greatest blood sugar control, there can be a higher chance of, needing medication to manage. There's a higher chance of C-sections, higher chance of induction, higher chance of a big baby, yada, 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 all these things. But within the spectrum of gestational diabetes, like I said, there are some cases that are very mild and some cases that require more medical intervention. Among those who have great blood sugar control, the chances of all of those associated risks are actually quite low. So, for example, the chance of having a large baby, there is a study called the HAPO study, or hyperglycemia and adverse pregnancy outcome study. It's like the largest to date on gestational diabetes, had over 23,000 women from 11 countries. It's like this huge amount of data. And they found the chance of having a large baby was actually quite low for women who had normal, they were looking at fasting blood sugar was most associated in this study. So normal fasting blood sugar, less than 90, the chance of having a large baby was like 10%, like not that big. When fasting blood sugar was over 100 on average, the chance was 25 to 35%, which is actually quite high. So just small little differences in blood sugar can make a big impact on your chances of having any of the associated complications or risks with birth or risks to your baby or whatever. But for the most part, gestational diabetes can really be well managed. It is definitely manageable with either a mix of diet and lifestyle, and everyone, even if they do require a little bit of medication help, that's still the central key part of it. And actually becomes even more important if you do need medication. By the way, you actually need to be more on top of your food and your lifestyle stuff. But it's totally manageable. And if your blood sugar is kept at normal levels, your risk of all these things go way, way, way down. I have plenty of women in my courses that have, normal, healthy, babies that are born at a normal weight, don't require a stay in the NICU, don't have breathing problems, don't go hypoglycemic, don't have any issues whatsoever. And many of them do not require a C-section or any sort of birth interventions. They can have a physiologic birth. So
that's awesome.
None of these things are required. They're just statistically, some of them are more likely. So when you're looking at information on gestational diabetes, just be aware that like almost everything published on the internet is not looking at the positive aspects of it. And they're most definitely on the fear-mongering side. So if you could just stay off Google, you'll probably be better off.
Yes, stay off Google, pay attention to your body. Absolutely. Yeah. Where can our listeners find you if they want more information about your book or your courses?
So the information about my book and course is available at realfoodforgd.com. GD, short for gestational diabetes. The book's up there. My online course is up there. I also have a free video series that talks about the basics of gestational diabetes, like what to do right when you're diagnosed, your goal blood sugar levels, some of the basic dietary changes, and some of the problems with the conventional approach to managing it. So that video series is free. Definitely check it out. And then my main blog is over at pilatesnutritionist.com, and there's a bunch of blogs on there on prenatal nutrition and a lot on gestational diabetes. So I'll send a link to you. There's one called 9 Gestational Diabetes Myths, and I'll send that to you to link to in the show notes, because that one goes through a lot of similar things we talked about today and a couple other points that we didn't get a chance to cover.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was phenomenal. So eye-opening and so helpful to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your wisdom with us. Gosh, it's eye-opening, right? I mean, this is not the message that you get. And we're talking about gestational diabetes specifically in this episode, but just generally, right? It really hits home to me especially, and I hope it does for you too, the importance of being well informed, and that so much of that information really comes from you and your body. Pay attention to what your body's telling you, because it will always tell you what's working and what needs to be changed. And that's regardless of what the research says, what the doctors say, because at the end of it all, it doesn't matter, right? If your body's saying, hey, we've got to change something up, that's really the ultimate truth right there. And this is so, so important for gestational diabetes, specifically like we're talking about today, because it's something that can be really scary and overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be, because there's so much that still is in your control. And I hope that by listening today, you have walked away with a sense of empowerment, that you are not a statistic. You are not going to be stuck with a particular fate, if you will, for the rest of your pregnancy, that with really positive, simple, but powerful lifestyle changes to diet, to exercise, to sleep, to stress, and all of these things, you actually can continue on and have a very healthy pregnancy and deliver a healthy baby. And that's absolutely possible for you. Thank you so much for joining me here today. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you can head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review so we can get more amazing guests like Lily and continue providing you with inspiration and tips and motivation to help you get through a high-risk pregnancy or pregnancy with complications. And if you are pregnant with complications and you want to learn how to help yourself stay pregnant as long as possible, head over to parijatdeshpande.com/perinatal, that's PERINATAL, and schedule a free consultation, and we'll talk about how I can help. And also, I'd love to stay in touch. So follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Parijat Desh. That's PARIJATDESH. Getting a diagnosis during a pregnancy can be really scary and really overwhelming. You just want everybody to be healthy. You want to be healthy. You want baby to be healthy. And having a name, having a label like gestational diabetes can be really overwhelming. But you are ultimately in control of how this progresses. Whether it requires medication or not, you still are in the driver's seat of your pregnancy. Take it one day, one step at a time. You can do this.